Welcome back to Stooge Stream. I'm your host, The Stooge, and this is another episode of Is It Worth Playing? In this episode, we're looking at the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis Classic Kid Chameleon. This game comes up on every Hidden Gems, top Genesis, top Mega Drive games list that you find, so let's get into it a little bit and see if it's any good. Before we do that, though, as a child that grew up in the 90s, I remember ads for this game in comic books, magazines, just everywhere. I was a Nintendo kid, so I had a NES and a Super NES, but my friends who had a Mega Drive, because I'm in a PAL region, always seemed to have this game. It was one of those games that was just everywhere. But is it any good? Let's check it out. Graphically, Kid Chameleon looks really nice for the 16-bit era. I have to admit, the sprite work in the game is nice. The sprites are all not massive, but big enough that you can make out exactly what you're looking at. And with some of the enemies, like the mechanical, weird tank things with a face that you need to jump on or attack, they look really cool. I think the sprite work in this game was really well done. The backgrounds look nice. Overall, the graphical style and artwork of Kid Chameleon is really good. It does have that 90s feel with the protagonist wearing, Kid Chameleon himself, a leather jacket when he's just in kid mode. He's really cool with his sunnies and his leather jacket and so forth. What about the sound? Well, it doesn't have a classic soundtrack. It's not going to be one of those games that you hum along to later on when you're just walking around. It's not memorable. It's not Sonic Green Hill Zone. It's not the opening theme to Super Mario Brothers or World 1-1. It's not the best soundtrack ever, and it also suffers a little bit from that Genesis Mega Drive ting. Now, a few of the sound effects in particular, like when you're in tank mode, firing the shots, just sound horrible. It's a real shame because it is a letdown as far as the presentation of the game goes. The sound effects just do not work, and I think it's mainly because this was probably designed separate to the Genesis. So they designed these great sound effects, and then when it was applied through the Genesis Mega Drive sound chip, it just didn't sound great. But overall, though, it's not bad. It can be a little bit grating at times, but it's nothing that will destroy the game. It just is a little bit disappointing as far as the lack of presentation of the title goes. Now let's get into the nuts and bolts and the meat of every one of these old school games, and that's the gameplay itself. How does it play? What's it about? So the game itself has a great upgrade system where you find all these different masks and you can upgrade into different characters. So for instance, if you find the samurai mask, all of a sudden you jump around a little bit better and you have a samurai sword that you can attack with rather than just having to jump on your enemies. There's all sorts of ridiculous power-ups. You can turn into a mosquito-type little superhero. You can turn into a tank, like I mentioned earlier. You can turn into a character that can grab walls. There's just all sorts of different power-ups, and that's really cool. The power-up system in this game works really well. It works a la Mario Brothers, where you have your power-up, you take a hit or two, you lose your power-up, you go back to Kid, you take another hit, you die. All in all, that works really, really well. I think the power-up system was really well thought out, well planned, and well executed in the game itself. There's an element of replayability in the fact that you'll do a level with a certain power-up and it may be a little bit more difficult than doing it with a different power-up, so you might try it a different way next time around. Speaking of levels, there's over 100 levels in this game. Now, as far as content in an old school game goes, that's spectacular. But there is a problem with this. There's no save system. There's no password system. So to finish this game, you have to sit there and play through 100 levels, all in one playthrough, to get to the end. That's kind of ridiculous. That's too much. I don't know anybody personally that's ever finished this game. I've never finished it. I know a lot of people that owned this back in the day. They never finished it. But everybody seems to have played it, but just nobody's finished it. And people remember the first couple of levels quite fondly and not much past that because the levels aren't small either. And over 100 of them, it's just a crazy mission to undertake and try and complete. So I think that's a bit of a down as far as the gameplay itself, because that takes away from it. You can never complete the game really unless you really want a marathon effort. Then, and if you have finished this, 10 points to you, because I don't have the patience or the tolerance for that long of a game. And the reason being is the next point of the gameplay, and that's the mechanics itself. I think some of them are a little bit poorly executed. The jump mechanic, for instance, feels really stiff and really heavy. The character almost feels top heavy, and looking at the sprite, you get that because he's got a massive head, but that shouldn't affect the physics of the game, and it seems to. So when the sprite, like when you jump, it just feels really heavy and awkward. The momentum physics in this are really awkward as well. It's getting up speed is really weird, like, and if you stop even slightly, you lose all your speed. I love a Sonic game and that, but it's just hard to build up momentum. So sometimes your jumps don't go as far as you want them to, and you fall to your death down a death pit because your momentum hadn't built up. The physics and the mechanics of this game just don't feel right to me. Coming from NES background and Mario Brothers, it was all about precise mechanical landing within a pixel, to this that you couldn't even judge your jumps half the time because you didn't know if the momentum was going to work properly. It's just too stiff and awkward. I really didn't like it. I thought that was a huge letdown to the game as well. So yeah, it was just a little bit too much to handle. Also, the level structure itself, before I forget, some of the levels were just way too big, and too much to explore and find everything and all the rest of it. Some of them were quite contained and linear and all of that, and I thought those were the better levels that I've played of Kid Chameleon. The ones that were a bit more open and explory, and even though, yes, it's a linear path from A to B, there's just all these other things that you can jump around and find and stuff. Some of them were a little bit ridiculous. So the design itself was just not great on some of those levels, but the design on some felt genius. It was kind of weird, and I think that came with the fact that there was just too many of them. Because there was too many levels, you dipped in quality from time to time. So let's wrap this up overall. Now, is it worth playing? This was a hard one. It really was. But my ultimate answer is going to be no. Now, before the hate and all the rest of it, let me explain. It's not due to the presentation, because the presentation is quite nice. Like I said, graphically, this game has really nice sprite work, nice backgrounds, nice variation in levels and so forth. The sound, though a little bit tingy and so forth, you kind of expect that from Mega Drive and Genesis games, so that's not a huge takeaway. It's just annoying. But that's fine, you can live with that. The reason I say no is purely down to two reasons. One, the gameplay. The mechanics just feel off. I just don't like it. And if you can fight through that, then by all means have at it. Personally, it just annoys me too much. And I just couldn't get into the game enough to want to do that, which gets me to point two, marathon of 100 levels. It's way too big. This is just supposed to be a simple platformer. But when you add into the context of so many levels, as well as it's not an easy game by any stretch of the imagination, it is quite difficult in a lot of its challenges and enemy placement and death pits. So it's just a grueling endurance marathon that I don't think anybody really wants to complete, and that's why I say it's not worth playing. Not because it's a horrible game, because by no means is it horrible, even the way I've been describing it. It's not a horrible game. It's really not. It's just average with too many levels. So that's why I say no. I think this is a skip. If you're collecting games for the Genesis and or Mega Drive, and you just want good quality games, maybe leave this one to the back of the list and concentrate on some other things first. Maybe some of the Thunder Force games, get all the Sonic games out of the way, that type of thing. Then maybe after you've gotten everything else you want, come back to Kid Chameleon, but I wouldn't put it at the top of your list. Anyway, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed. Plenty more content coming on Stooge Stream soon, including our WCPW recap, next episode of Impact Wrestling recap, more streams of me, the Stooge, playing Star Ocean, and some more King of Fighters challenges coming up.